Hi there, and welcome to Elevator Pitch Economics. In this video, we're going to discuss whether or not there is a causal relationship between maternal employment and childhood weight problems. And to do so, we're going to use a paper by Anderson, Butcher, and Levine from 2002. As the title suggests, the paper tries to use analysis in order to see if there is a relationship between maternal employment and childhood weight problems, as both increased around the same time. Now, when we normally look at neoclassical and behavioural models, it's always the actions undertaken by individuals which affect those same individuals. So what's the mechanism between mothers in employment and their children becoming overweight? And the first mechanism is that increases in maternal employment will mean that children are more likely to receive unhealthy foods. This could be due to the time constraint of the mother. The mother is now working more hours and therefore comes home at a later time. And because the mother is coming home at a later time, she has less time to, say, prepare more healthy foods. And she is more incentivized to order takeaways or fast foods. The second is due to the inexperience of the childcare provider. Because the mother is in employment, she may have to hire a childcare provider, and this childcare provider may not have the culinary experience to provide children with healthy foods. The second mechanism is that children will receive less supervision because their mother is away in employment, and this leads to two bad things. For one, they're going to spend more time indoors. They're going to spend more time watching television or playing video games, rather than being outdoors and playing sports. And that might be in part because the mother is concerned for their safety, so she'd rather have them indoors while she is away. The second is they're more likely to make bad nutritional choices. Without mother's supervision, they're more likely to, say, go to chicken shops or go to the kebab shop after school. The data which is used to support the analysis is a household survey called the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, which is from the US. And importantly, it does contain indicators for child BMI, along with a virtually complete working history for the mother, both total hours worked and total weeks worked, which are used to calculate the household exposure to mother's employment. The data also contains indicators for education, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. And in order to test if there's a relationship, they use a regression analysis in the form of a probit model. Now, the paper notes that there could be omitted variable bias. For example, mothers who work could be less motivated or culturally less likely to feed children healthy foods. So in order to test for omitted variable bias, they use 4 additional specifications. Now, the details of these specifications are in the paper, but we won't go into detail on those in this video. And on screen are the results from the probit model regressions. Now, one thing to note is that the dependent variable is the probability that a child becomes overweight. And the other thing is that they have 4 different specifications. And in each specification, they've basically added more and more control variables. The reason they've done this is just to basically build a range, so they can say that the impact on the probability that a child is overweight is between X and Y%. So I briefly mentioned before that they did 4 additional specifications in order to test for omitted variable bias. And when you look in this section of the paper, they just say that the coefficients produced from these additional specifications are very similar to the coefficients produced in the probit model regressions, the ones I had on screen earlier. And this just basically means that the regression analysis is fit for purpose and there's no indication of omitted variable bias, which would bias the results of the analysis. And on screen are the results from the probit model regressions. And one thing to note is that the signs of the coefficients are very much in line with what has been found in other academic research on the topic of obesity. Now, the dependent variable is the probability that a child is overweight. So if, for example, we look at education, what it's saying is if you give a mother an extra year of education, you decrease the probability that her child becomes overweight by between 0.4 and 0.6%. Now there's a negative correlation if the child is breastfed, but a positive correlation if the mother is overweight, obese, or Black/Hispanic. Whereas things like the mother's marital status, family income, and the age of the child or the life stage of the child has no effect on the probability that they become overweight. Now, the key headline from the analysis is that if a mother works 10 hours more per week, she will increase the likelihood that her child becomes overweight by between 0.7 and 1.2 percentage points. The authors also do something called subgroups analysis, and this basically involves cutting the data and rerunning the analysis on certain groups. So what they're doing is they're basically asking, is there still a relationship between maternal employment and the probability that a child becomes overweight if I just look at, say, the richest families or the most educated families, or if I look at just certain race backgrounds? And what they find when they do this subgroups analysis is that statistical significance only holds when you run the analysis for families with high incomes who are well educated and from white race backgrounds. Now, the reason this is a very surprising finding is because we would have assumed that families from high income backgrounds and families from well educated backgrounds, they would be in a much better position to provide their children with, say, high quality expensive care and more healthy expensive foods. And there are two reasons given for the finding. The first is the mechanisms I mentioned before. Children will receive less healthy foods and they'll also receive less supervision. The other reason given focuses on families from low income backgrounds and families of low educational attainment. And for these it's said that the mother is already extremely busy. So adding employment and adding more hours when they're already time constrained, it's not likely to have any impact on child BMI. At the same time, with these families, it's likely they don't have any access to, say, a good grocery store, access to play areas where the children can do sports and activities, and good transport links. So even if the mother was to move into employment and the family were to increase their income, it's not likely that that increase in income will eventually translate into a reduction in child BMI. And as a policy analyst, I think it's quite interesting to look at these papers and to see if there's any policy implications. So if I were to receive this paper, would I base any policies on it? Well, for a start, it's very difficult because there are issues with the analysis. For example, it doesn't look at care quality, it doesn't look at access to recreation, and it doesn't really look at access to sports. It notices them as mechanisms, but it doesn't do any, say, deep quantitative or qualitative analysis on them. I think what would also be interesting is to look at paternal employment. In the UK, Europe, and across North America, there have been changes in paternity laws which incentivize more fathers to leave the workforce and spend more time looking after their children. So it will be interesting to see if these changes have had an impact on a child BMI and the probability that a child becomes overweight. And based on the results of the paper, should we actually reduce the number of hours mothers work? Well, I'd argue this wouldn't be a good idea. For one, there'll be a big cost to business. They would lose quite a lot of their labour force. And at the same time, you're taking away the choice of a mother to work in employment. And even if you were to implement it, you would have to introduce, say, a cap or reduce the number of hours by a certain amount. So it'll be very difficult to implement. At the same time, what we noted before is that the effect is only significant for a certain demographic. So how would you change the laws for that demographic alone? But what do you think? Let me know what you think in the comments, and of course if you found it useful, please give this video a like and feel free to subscribe.